All right, so last time we talked about the British establishing their own state of Israel after World War I, and how that went over pretty poorly with the Palestinians already living there. But now it's the 1970s, 1980s, and the Arab world is looking to make a comeback. So in the wake of the Six-Day War, which saw Israel conquer even more land, two new militant groups emerged on the Palestinian scene, namely the terrorist group Hamas and the more political Fatah movement. They were both founded in the 1960s as a response to the growing Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. Although the two groups had similar goals, Fatah sought to achieve Palestinian independence through a mixture of diplomacy and armed struggle, while Hamas wanted an independent Islamic State. During this period, there were still many calls for peaceful coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis. The PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, called for a federal state encompassing both Israelis and Palestinians. Unfortunately, these peace talks did not include the most important party involved, the Israelis. Now, if they weren't going to be included, then there was no point in them trying to negotiate with the Palestinians either. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation was getting increasingly tense. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, has been marked by a number of human rights violations against Palestinians, including arbitrary detention without trial, torture, extrajudicial killings, and collective punishment. The Palestinian response to this mistreatment has included acts of violence such as stone throwing, bombings, and shootings, which have resulted in civilian casualties on both sides. Despite all of this, the PLO, which mostly consisted of the Fatah movement at this point, managed to get recognition of Palestine as a state from most countries in the UN. This was in 1974, however, did not become a full member state due to opposition from the United States and Israel. But really this didn't matter all that much because the Palestinians never really considered the UN to be an honest broker in the first place. With the Palestinians and Israelis deadlocked in their positions, the only real option left for the Palestinians was to keep fighting for their statehood. But who would they fight? Well, for Palestinians, their enemy was anyone that supported Israel, whether that be the government of Israel or the government of another nation. In particular, Palestinians targeted Jews because, well, the state of Israel was mostly populated by Jews. In fact, one of the most infamous attacks during this period was the massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972, Black September. A Palestinian group affiliated with the PLO killed 2 Israelis immediately and then took 9 more hostage. After a failed rescue attempt by the Germans, all of the hostages were killed along with a German policeman. And as you can probably guess, this event increased support for Israel in the international stage, especially amongst the Western powers. To say nothing of the fact that when the Arab nations asked the UN to intervene in the conflict, it didn't happen because the Soviet Union had just fallen, and the Americans weren't interested in making any more enemies. That being said, the Americans did take a bit of interest in the conflict when a group of terrorists bombed a disco frequented by US soldiers in Berlin. But this wasn't really out of the goodness of their hearts, but rather to appease their own citizens. After all, no one likes having their soldiers bombed by mysterious assailants. In the end, the US brought Arafat to Washington to try and strike a deal. But even this meeting was strained because Arafat refused to recognize Israel's right to even exist, let alone their right to any land. Nonetheless, negotiations did take place. And in 1987, the US brokered the first intifada, or uprising, against the Israelis. However, this was primarily a non-violent protest that saw Palestinians rioting and civil disobedience against the Israelis. It ended up getting pretty bloody, though, and it eventually devolved into a full-on rebellion where Palestinians were attacking Israeli targets and vice versa. As a result, the Israelis responded with even more force, killing hundreds of Palestinians. Now, thankfully for the Palestinians, the second intifada in the late 1980s would see more success. In 1993, Israel and the PLO finally signed the Oslo Accords, which officially recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. But it's important to note that it didn't recognize a Palestinian state, just the PLO as the representatives of one. But this was a huge step forward nonetheless. The Oslo Accords also established the Palestinian Authority, which was meant to be a temporary self-governing body that would lead to full independence down the line. But of course, things didn't quite work out that way. You see, the Israelis had somewhat of a change of heart. When it came to giving up their occupied territories, it's likely because they realized that the Palestinian militants were not going to go away quietly. Instead, the Israelis decided to keep expanding Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which was supposed to be a temporary measure according to international law. The Palestinians, of course, weren't too happy about this. So in 2000, a new Palestinian militant group called Hamas won a majority in Palestinian elections. But then shortly after, the Second Intifada broke out. Hamas praised the Intifada as a jihad against the Zionist entity, and hundreds of Israelis were killed by Palestinian militants. The Israelis, of course, responded with overwhelming force, killing thousands of Palestinians, and neither side budged. The Palestinians wanted all of the West Bank and Gaza Strip to form their own state. The Israelis wanted to hold on to the West Bank indefinitely. And so, for the next few decades, the Israelis kept building more settlements on Palestinian land. They built a wall around the West Bank, which ended up being 10 feet tall and 25 feet deep. They fought against Palestinian militants until they couldn't fight anymore. But still, despite all of this, the Palestinians refused to back down. They still want their state, and they're willing to fight for it too. In fact, in recent years, Hamas has launched rockets into Israel from their base in Gaza, and the Israelis have retaliated with airstrikes. Just look at what happened in 2021. Now, of course, this isn't to say that the Palestinians are completely in the right here. I mean, after all, they do condone terrorist attacks against civilians. But it's also important not to forget that the Palestinians are the ones who are being occupied. And many of the attacks on Israeli civilians are actually in retaliation to Israeli brutality against Palestinians. In fact, it's estimated that since the terrorist attack of October 7, 2023, which saw Hamas launch an all-out assault on southern Israel, the Israelis have killed over 3,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip alone. The question is, will the Palestinians ever get their state? I don't know. Maybe. It doesn't look like it right now. But hey, stranger things have happened. If you'd like to help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, click the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.